When the cruelest CEO in Manhattan faced his board that morning, the doorman's black notebook was about to change everything. The sun had barely risen in Manhattan when James Wilson adjusted his bow tie, impeccably aligned with his navy blue uniform. At 60, his posture was as straight as on the first day he stepped into the luxurious lobby of Manhattan Summit Tower 15 years ago. His brown eyes, marked by laugh lines that betrayed years of sincere smiles, carefully observed every detail of the lobby as he prepared for another workday. Manhattan Summit Tower wasn't just another skyscraper in New York. It was a symbol of power and prestige, where the world's largest corporations maintained their offices. For James, however, it was much more than that. It was his small kingdom of observation. Every day, precisely at 6:45 a.m., James took his post by the revolving glass and steel doors. With almost surgical precision, he memorized the schedules, routines, and especially the names of each person who passed through. "Good morning, Ms. Martinez. Is that caramel coffee still keeping you awake?" He smiled at the young executive from the 42nd floor. "Mr. Thompson, has your daughter recovered from the flu?" he asked the lawyer from the 38th. His extraordinary memory and attention to detail made each greeting unique and personal, transforming routine encounters into special moments. What impressed people most wasn't just his ability to remember details, but how James seemed to anticipate everyone's needs. On rainy days, he always had an extra umbrella to lend. When an executive forgot their badge, he was already calling security before they needed to ask. His small kindnesses were like delicate brushstrokes on a larger canvas, creating a masterpiece of service that few really noticed, but all secretly appreciated. To many, he was just the doorman, that friendly figure who opened doors and offered smiles. But there was something in his gaze, a depth that suggested he saw much more than he let on. Manhattan Summit Tower was like a microcosm of society, where human dramas unfolded daily before James's attentive eyes. He observed the promotions and dismissals, the discreet romances and corporate rivalries, the hidden tears and forced smiles. At his post, he witnessed the daily parade of power, ambition, and human vulnerability. While keeping the doors open with a gentle smile, James absorbed every detail, every nuance of the stories unfolding around him. It was as if fate had placed him there for a greater reason that no one could yet understand. Like a silent shadow in the corner of the lobby, James Wilson kept his thoughts to himself, but his eyes registered everything. On that particular morning, while observing the coming and going of employees, something in the air seemed different. It was as if an invisible energy was building up, foreshadowing changes that no one could predict. What no one knew was that behind that gentle smile and impeccable uniform, there was much more than a simple doorman. Fate was about to reveal that sometimes the truest power hides in the most unlikely places. While everyone saw just an ordinary man at his daily post, the universe was conspiring to transform this simple doorman into the catalyst for a change that no one could imagine. The day began like any other at Manhattan Summit Tower, until the sound of Blake Thompson's Italian shoes echoed through the marble lobby. As CEO of Summit Global Corp., he emanated an aura of toxic authority that made employees avert their eyes and change direction when they saw him. His custom-made suit and luxury watch seemed like armor that separated him from the rest of humanity. With each step he took, the environment changed, smiles disappeared, conversations ceased, and a palpable tension filled the air. Sarah Chen, a recently promoted junior analyst, was having a particularly difficult day. Her babysitter had cancelled at the last minute, forcing her to leave her sick child with a neighbor and arrive 10 minutes late. When the elevator doors opened, Blake was there, his icy gaze fixed on his wristwatch. What followed was a demonstration of calculated cruelty that made the entire lobby freeze. "You think you can waste company time because you decided to have a child?" His cutting voice echoed through the environment. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face as she tried to explain the situation. Public humiliation had become Blake's favorite sport. He seemed to feed off the fear and insecurity he provoked in others. "Maybe you should rethink your life choices if you can't meet basic commitments," he continued, his voice laden with contempt. The lobby was in morbid silence, except for Sarah's contained sobs. Executives looked away, some pretending to check their phones, others hurrying to their offices, all silent accomplices to this display of power. James observed the scene from his post, his hands discreetly gripping the counter while maintaining his professional expression. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed Blake's cruel behavior, but something that morning seemed different. The way he deliberately chose his victims, like a predator selecting its prey, revealed a disturbing pattern. The CEO seemed especially merciless with employees who had no power to defend themselves, transforming personal vulnerabilities into weapons against them. When Sarah finally managed to compose herself enough to head to her floor, James discreetly offered her a tissue and a glass of water. Blake, who had already moved on, left behind a heavy atmosphere of fear and tension. In the silence that followed, something changed in the doorman's always gentle eyes. Behind his serene expression, a silent resolution began to take shape, like a storm forming on the horizon. At that moment, no one could imagine that every tear shed in the lobby was being accounted for, and that the price of cruelty would be much higher than Blake Thompson could ever calculate. The third month of Blake Thompson's reign of terror brought subtle changes to Manhattan's Summit Tower. James noticed the signs: deeper, dark circles, trembling hands holding coffee cups, whispered conversations in corners. The lobby, once a place of casual meetings and cordial smiles, had transformed into a zone of constant tension. Employees arrived increasingly early, fearing to encounter Blake, and left increasingly late, trying to prove their worth through endless overtime. It was on a rainy Tuesday that Michael Donovan, senior project manager for 20 years at the company, had his breakdown. James saw him stumble out of the meeting room on the 45th floor, his face pale and breathing irregular. Michael barely made it to the lobby before his legs gave way. In seconds, James was at his side, discreetly guiding him to a bench away from curious eyes. "He threatened to fire my entire team," Michael whispered between labored breaths. "Said we're all dispensable, that our 2 decades of dedication mean nothing." The building's corridors began to echo with similar stories. At his post, James heard fragments of conversations that painted an increasingly darker picture. A young analyst confided to a colleague that she had started taking anxiety medication. A department manager admitted he could no longer sleep, haunted by the constant fear of losing everything he had worked for. The corporate environment, which was already naturally competitive, had transformed into something toxic and suffocating. During coffee breaks, James noticed how groups of employees became increasingly smaller and more reserved. People who used to chat animatedly now exchanged only worried looks and discreet nods. Fear had infiltrated every corner of the building, transforming colleagues into competitors and friends into strangers. Blake Thompson had managed to create an environment where distrust was the only constant, and solidarity was a luxury no one could afford to show. In his small black notebook, James began recording not just names and preferences, but also behavioral changes and worrying incidents. His notes, which before served to personalize greetings, now documented a disturbing pattern of psychological abuse and moral harassment. While helping another employee in crisis, offering a glass of water and a moment of dignity away from others' eyes, James felt the weight of each story accumulating on his shoulders. The corridors of Manhattan's Summit Tower held dark secrets that whispered for justice, and soon those whispers would transform into a cry that no one could ignore. Winter was approaching Manhattan, and with it, an even icier tension hung in the air at Summit Tower. James was at his usual post when raised voices in the executive elevator caught his attention. The doors briefly opened at the ground floor, revealing Blake Thompson and 2 board executives in a heated discussion. No one noticed the silent doorman, who discreetly adjusted his security radio earpiece, catching every word of the conversation that continued when the doors closed again. 300 layoffs before Christmas will give a significant boost to the stock, Blake's voice echoed through the communication system. Shareholders will be pleased with the increased market value, and my year-end bonus will be substantial. The coldness in his voice while discussing the fate of hundreds of families made James imperceptibly press the radio button in his hand. The elevator continued ascending, and with it, more details of the cruel plan were revealed. Among the layoff targets was the development team that had just won the National Technology Innovation Award. Their project had saved millions for the company and received international recognition, but Blake saw only numbers on a spreadsheet. They think they're irreplaceable because of this insignificant award. His laughter echoed through the system. We'll show that no one is indispensable in this company. Besides, we've already registered the patent in the corporation's name. The conversation continued, detailing how the layoffs would be strategically executed to maximize stock value. Blake planned to announce the cuts gradually, starting with the most vulnerable employees, those with family health problems, single mothers, people close to retirement. His logic was that these employees would have less ability to legally contest the dismissals, saving on possible labor lawsuits. The plan was so meticulously cruel that even the other executives in the elevator seemed uncomfortable, although no one dared confront Blake directly. James remained in his position, his serene expression masking the inner storm that was forming. While the CEO and his companions coldly discussed the fate of hundreds of lives, something definitively changed in the doorman's gaze. A silent decision was made at that moment, one that would forever change the destiny of Manhattan Summit Tower. While Blake Thompson planned his cruelest move, he had no idea that his own words in the elevator had just sealed his fate, and that justice had ears in the walls of Manhattan Summit Tower. In his small compartment at the front desk, James began establishing a new routine. Between usual greetings and his daily tasks, he now dedicated every free moment to meticulously documenting each incident he witnessed. His black notebook, previously used only to note employees' preferences and birthdays, had transformed into a detailed record of every abuse of power, every tear shed, every moment of despair that echoed through Manhattan Summit Tower's lobby. The arrival of Amanda Torres, a 6-month pregnant executive, brought a new chapter of cruelty to the building. Blake, upon discovering her pregnancy, initiated a systematic campaign of moral harassment. Meetings were purposely scheduled at the end of the workday, urgent reports were demanded minutes before her medical appointments, derogatory comments about her condition were made loudly in the lobby. James observed everything, his pen silently gliding across paper, recording each detail with a chronicler's precision. The changes in employees' behavior were subtle but significant. People who once walked confidently now moved like shadows through the corridors. The sound of laughter, once common during coffee breaks, had been replaced by tense whispers and apprehensive glances. James noticed how some began bringing food from home, avoiding using the cafeteria where Blake usually made his humiliating public pronouncements. During his breaks, James methodically organized his notes. Each incident was categorized, dated, and correlated with other similar events. His observations went beyond simple facts. He recorded behavior patterns, recurring intimidation tactics, and the visible impact on employee morale. What no one realized was that behind this apparently mundane ritual of note-taking, a devastating dossier was being born. While everyone saw only a discreet doorman doing his job, James was silently weaving a web of evidence that would become impossible to ignore. His gentle eyes, which seemed to only observe the lobby's movement, were actually documenting each piece of a larger puzzle. And while Blake continued his reign of terror, never sparing a glance for the man who held the door for him every day, the truth was being written, word by word, in a simple black notebook. Amid the silent chaos taking over Manhattan Summit Tower, no one imagined that this quiet man in his impeccable uniform was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most devastating power comes from hands that no one notices. The notification of the extraordinary board meeting fell like a bomb at Manhattan Summit Tower. Blake Thompson was furious, pacing back and forth in his top-floor office. No one knew exactly who had called the meeting or what would be on the agenda, but the official memo carried the weight of powerful signatures that not even Blake could ignore. The CEO spent the entire day making frantic calls, trying to discover who was behind it all. The atmosphere of tension spread through the corridors like smoke. Executives ran from one room to another, documents were shredded in unusual volume, and impromptu meetings happened in every corner of the building. In the midst of all this chaos, James continued his work with the same serenity as always. He opened doors, greeted people, and observed the silent panic taking over the building. His calmness contrasted dramatically with the agitation around him, like the eye of a hurricane. Blake made 3 visits to the lobby that day, something completely out of his usual pattern. In each one, surrounded by nervous assistants and worried lawyers, he seemed increasingly uncontrolled. His normally controlled face now showed a mixture of anger and fear. In a particularly tense moment, he even shouted at his own reflection in the elevator mirror, blaming everyone around him for the mysterious situation unfolding. The tension reached its peak when a group of external auditors arrived at the building in the middle of the afternoon. James received them with his usual courtesy, directing them to the elevators with a serene smile. The panic in Blake's eyes, upon seeing them cross the lobby, was palpable. For the first time since taking the CEO position, he seemed truly shaken, as if finally realizing something was out of his control. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting elongated shadows across the marble lobby, Manhattan Summit Tower seemed to hold its breath. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning, and no one knew what to expect. James, finishing his shift, arranged his desk as he always did, tucked his inseparable black notebook into the inner pocket of his uniform, and prepared to leave. His face showed no particular emotion, but his eyes had a different gleam. The gears of fate were already in motion, and the following morning would bring a revelation that would make everyone realize that true power isn't always in the hands of those who shout the loudest. The boardroom on the 50th floor of Manhattan Summit Tower was packed that morning. Blake Thompson occupied his usual position at the head of the table, his arrogance trying to mask the anxiety evident in his restless eyes. Board members, lawyers, and senior executives filled every available chair, the air heavy with expectation. When the doors opened one last time, no one was prepared for what they saw. James Wilson, still in his doorman's uniform, calmly entered the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake was the first to react, his voice laden with disdain. "What is this employee doing here?" Before anyone could answer, a group of lawyers stood up. The eldest among them, a gentleman with graying hair, cleared his throat and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Mr. James Wilson, majority shareholder of Summit Global Corp., controlling 45% of the company's shares." The shock was immediate. Blake turned pale, board members gasped, and some executives nearly dropped their coffee cups. With the same calmness he demonstrated while opening doors in the lobby, James walked to the table and placed his famous black notebook on it. "For months," he began, his voice surprisingly firm and authoritative, "I have observed and documented every incident of power abuse, moral harassment, and mismanagement that occurred in this building." Page after page, he presented meticulously collected evidence, testimonies, elevator recordings, incident records, patterns of abusive behavior, and the planning of mass layoffs for personal benefit. Blake tried to interrupt several times, but each attempt was silenced by new, even more damning evidence. The CEO watched, helpless, as his reputation and authority crumbled before his eyes. James continued his presentation, revealing not just the abuses, but also a series of questionable decisions that had harmed the company in favor of personal gains. With each new revelation, Blake's face grew paler, while board members exchanged worried looks. The meeting reached its climax when James finally turned directly to Blake. "Mr. Thompson, you are officially removed from the position of CEO of Summit Global Corp., effective immediately." His voice, though firm, maintained the same gentleness with which he greeted people in the lobby. "This company will no longer be a kingdom of terror. From today, we will implement a zero-tolerance policy against any form of harassment or abuse of power." Blake, completely defeated, was escorted out of the room by security guards, while James remained standing, still in his doorman's uniform, now recognized as the most powerful man in the building. In that historic moment, everyone at Manhattan Summit Tower learned that true power isn't in titles or the ability to cause fear, but in the silent strength of those who choose to make a difference, even when no one is watching. The transformation of Manhattan Summit Tower began the next day. James's first official act as board chairman was to implement a complete reform of corporate policies. Salaries were reviewed and equalized, ending historical disparities of gender and race. A comprehensive wellness program was established, including on-site daycare, psychological assistance, and flexible hours. Most surprisingly, however, was that James maintained his position as doorman, refusing to occupy the penthouse that traditionally belonged to the CEO. The corridors, once silent and tense, began to come alive again. The award-winning development team not only kept their jobs, but received proper recognition and bonuses for their innovative work. Amanda Torres, the pregnant executive who had suffered harassment, was promoted to Human Resources Director with the specific mission of ensuring a healthy and inclusive work environment. The fear that once permeated each floor was gradually replaced by a sense of security and purpose. James continued greeting everyone in the morning, but now his smiles were returned with a new type of respect and admiration. His decision to maintain the doorman's uniform sent a powerful message. True leadership doesn't need external symbols of power. In board meetings, his opinions were heard attentively not because of his shareholding position, but for the wisdom that his daily observations brought. He had proven that understanding people at the most basic level was the key to truly effective management. The changes at Manhattan Summit Tower began to draw attention from the corporate world. Business magazines published articles about the Doorman CEO and his revolutionary management approach. Other companies began sending representatives to study the work model implemented by James. The building, which before was known only for its economic power, now became a symbol of corporate transformation and humanization of work relationships. As the months passed, James Wilson's legacy solidified. Productivity naturally increased without the need for threats or pressure. The employee turnover rate plummeted, and Summit Global Corporates became recognized as one of the best companies to work for. And there was James, every day at his post, opening doors and smiling at people coming and going. His black notebook now recorded a different story, that of a company that discovered true success comes when you put people first. Manhattan's Summit Tower had transformed into a beacon of hope in the corporate world, proving that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a simple act of kindness, and that the most enduring power is that exercised with humility and compassion.